Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of Building a Family Business here on Builder Funnel Radio. As usual, I've got the crew here. So Wes and Brooks, how are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Doing pretty good, Spence.
Good. Well, today we're gonna go a little bit different of a route because we got a question off the gram, as the cool kids say these days, and it was from a 200-person company, the construction company, and the question was, hey, we're considering an ESOP, but we want to keep the family business and maintain that like family connection. You know, are there some other options? So the three of us were kind of talking about this and figured this was a good opportunity to lay out the different options. You guys can kind of share some of your experience with different types of entities. Brooks, where do we start? You know, ESOP is kind of a big topic, but there's lots of different business structures that you can set up, right?
Oh, Brooks, so before you start, though, I mean, really, I think we should just do a disclaimer on this show, which is, hey, we are not professionals. So, you need to,
not attorneys.
What they say, you should
people,
consult
yeah.
consult your tax professional.
Advisor.
A lot of opinions going on around here.
Yeah, right.
So.
Yeah, we're just some owners that have experienced a few different things, and so yeah, we want to give you our insights.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, an ESOP is employee stock ownership plan, and pretty complicated. So before we dive into that, there's some other ownership plans that you can have or ways you can own companies, and I'm sure our listeners have done all of the above. So one of them is, a lot of us start out as a sole proprietor. You're just going to be one owner and usually running under your social security number, and you may or may not be doing a separate tax return. Partnerships, maybe you're in partners with somebody. It might be your spouse. It might be, someone else you started out with, and partnerships have their own tax return and a separate tax ID number. And then, Wes, maybe you want to pick up on the C Corp and the S Corp.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the C Corp, I think we tend to think of C Corps more like our typically, your larger companies, your publicly traded companies, they have stock, correct? And the stock can be purchased and sold. It doesn't have to be a publicly traded C Corp. It could be a privately owned C Corp. And an example would be that, our father had a C Corp for many, many years early on in his construction experience. And this is before the S Corp was invented. And we're going to talk about the S Corp in just a second. But the main disadvantage of a C Corp, I mean, I guess the advantage is you have stock, and so you can sell stock to somebody else, and it's a good way to transfer ownership. It's also its own separate entity. So the way they think about corporations in a legal sense is that they are their own person. So you can sue a corporation. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're suing a particular private party. So the corporation is a person, so that can be sued, and that provides some corporate shield to the owners of the corporation. So that's one of the reasons that corporations exist, is for that shield. So that being said, if you had a C Corp and you had stock, you're going to file your own separate tax return. And in a C Corp, the C Corp is actually going to pay its own taxes because it's a person. And so it's going to pay its own taxes. It's going to have these retained earnings. But when the owner wants to take money out of the C Corporation, he or she has to pay taxes again personally. So that was the biggest, yeah. So
they take it out as a dividend.
Yeah, exactly. They take it as a dividend and pay taxes on the dividend. So in a lot of ways, the C Corp fell out of favor for smaller organizations just because of this double taxation issue. Like in our dad's case, eventually he was able to convert his C Corp to an S Corp. And so the S Corp just basically rolls the income or loss from your corporation right up into your personal return. And so it's all there together. And so you only get taxed once, whatever your overall personal rate is. It just kind of rolls up into that. And, your tax accountant can walk you through all that. But I think that's why generally you don't see C Corps anymore for smaller organizations. They're too clunky, and there's definitely tax disadvantages to that. But the S Corp, Brooks will probably talk about LLCs, because we're talking about LLCs a lot on the program, just as a great way to hold real estate. But LLCs can elect to report as S corporations, which just means that they take their taxes or their income and they just roll it right up into the owners of the LLC's personal returns. So, Brooks, do you want to talk about LLCs at all, or LLPs?
Yeah, I guess one of the other things, Wes, that was popular back in the 90s as C Corps fell out of favor, especially in real estate, were limited partnerships. And limited partnerships provided a liability shield just like a C Corp did, but had more tax benefits. And that was the first time where you could get a limited partnership where you could own real estate in a minority way and have a K1, or basically your income as a K1 would then flow up to your personal return. And about 10 years later, then the next thing that came are limited liability companies, LLCs, again, giving you liability protection. And then those would roll up, produce a K1. And then, as Wes said, those limited liability corporations, LLCs, now most of them elect to be a sub S. So everything just flows up to your tax return. So you're not stuck with being taxed twice. And they're great for real estate because any distributions you take flow into or income flow into your tax return. And when you sell, then you're just taxed at a capital gains rate versus a regular income rate. So that's why real estate is good for that. And construction companies are perfect. We've had several construction companies set up as LLCs. And if you're into development, then you have a different LLC for every project you do. But the neat thing about LLCs is that it allows the owners can elect a manager, and that manager runs that LLC. And that's a great way to, you can have different ownership structures, but have different managers. So managers don't necessarily have to be an owner. They could be a minority owner or something like that. So that's why the LLC, I think, became very popular with people in real estate or in construction.
So with the LLC, why would you choose to elect to file as a S Corp or not elect? What's the primary difference there?
I don't have any idea. It's just what my tax accountant told me to do. So.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Essentially what you just want to make sure that you just elect to file as an S, because then you don't have to file a separate return. This is my understanding.
I think now we still create a separate return that creates a K1. That K1 flows up to your personal return, and so you don't file taxes for the You do a return, but you don't file it. So you're only filing one return now. It's your personal return, and behind it are any K1s that come from limited liability companies or any kind of LLC.
I mean, I think the nice thing too about an LLC or an S Corp, either way, is that it is pretty easy then to take cash out if you need to, because you just do what's called a AAA distribution. I mean, you're going to keep track of how much equity you've built up in your equity section of your balance sheet, and when you need to take some cash out, provided you have some cash available and it's not tied up in projects or something, you've already paid the taxes on whatever's in that account, and you can just pick the cash out. So, so that makes it pretty easy too.
So then, with the question of the ESOP, then is that just a matter of whatever structure you have currently? Then you're looking at converting it to that, just like you said, your dad was converting his C Corp to an S Corp. I think
what you have is you have a C Corp or a sub S, or a C Corp filing as a sub S. Then you have shares, and then I think that's where the ESOP comes into play. Employee stock ownership plan, and it has to do with they're popular if you have multiple employees. So yeah, if you do have 200 or 300 employees, you're trying to, and you maybe one of your goals is you're trying to get ownership, or you're actually just trying to get equity to your employees to help them, and further their financial goals. And, that might be one of the reasons for doing that. That allows you to do it because you can transfer stock over time, or, as Wes, you were talking, I guess, people could get a loan, and maybe you could explain how that might work.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, well, let's predicate this part of the discussion by saying ESOPs are super complicated, and and we don't know a ton about them, other than I think in terms of the loan, what you do is you take out a loan, or the ESOP would take out a loan, and that's how the cash gets paid out to the owners who are setting up the ESOP. So part of their ESOP, right, is that the original owners of the company want to take their cash out and transfer ownership to their employees. And that's how, of course, the employees are going, well, we don't have enough cash to do this. So there has to be a loan from an entity that is lent to the ESOP, and then the ESOP can buy shares, or however that ownership transfer happens from the original owners. I think, so in a lot of ways you go, wow, an ESOP, that's great. That's an employee-driven company. And I think that's one question that the family has to ask, or the original owners has to ask, is what are their goals, around that? Are they trying to transfer ownership to future family members and employees? I mean, are they really trying to keep the original flavor of the company to be a family company and want the family to be driving that culture and everything? Or do they want the employees in the future to be driving the culture of the company? Because your culture is going to be driven by whoever's running the company and whoever owns the company, right? So I think that's one of those basic questions which would help you decide what ownership structure you'd want to have is what's our long-term goals.
Yeah, I think I would always recommend, you take a step back, and as you're thinking about different plans, before you start thinking about the different plans, have you taken that step back and figured out and talked to all the stakeholders to see, what's important to them? You as owner, family members that are maybe aren't stakeholders yet, but you see as potential stakeholders, or maybe they're family members and employees, so they may have a different perspective working in the business. And then you have employees or stakeholders, suppliers, trades or stakeholders, and try to think about, and ask the questions, what are people interested in? Because you might work on a plan and find out, oh, nobody was actually that interested in that plan. And,
Yeah, I feel like that happens a lot too. You just you get an idea in your head and you go, oh, this could work. And you kind of start charging down that path, and whether you go through with it or not is one thing. But I think you guys have mentioned this on several, of our conversations in the past, is taking that step back and going, what am I really trying to accomplish? But then also starting that conversation, because you've mentioned several times, there's so many other people that it affects or that are involved, and they have varying degrees of interest and passion, or desire to be involved at some level. So it sounds like that's really the first step.
I think so. I mean, because one of the big mistakes we can make, just as people in general, is that we assume that everyone has the same desires, interests, and motivations that we do. So as a business owner, lots of times you're going, well, I wanted to own a business. Wouldn't everyone want to own a business? And what you find is that, well, that's not really true necessarily. And so I think sometimes, I think with the general idea of an ESOP, where the employees are going to own the business, the question is do they want to? Do they really want to be in that place? And do you want to go through the difficulties and all the challenges of setting up an ESOP? Sounds like they're fairly complicated and fairly expensive to administer. There's yearly charges that you have to lots of filing, different reports you need to file. You've got things like employees coming on and off the plan as people quit or hire on. How does all of that work? It's pretty complicated. So you really got to have a strong desire on the ownership, on the employee side, to be part of this company and make all that work, because it's going to siphon some of your bottom line away.
Well, yeah, for sure. And it's also, it's going to be as complicated or more complicated probably more complicated than your 401k. So where you have third-party administration and a lot of expenses that you think, and if you're thinking, oh, I just want to set up a 401k for my employees, so it'll be great, it'll be good for me, and you find out, oh, it actually is expensive. And the ESOP will be that same kind of thing. But I think anytime you're trying to transfer equity and ownership, it is complicated. So you just have to decide, what's your commitment. So a lot of times when especially anytime you bring someone into ownership who is not a family member or you haven't worked with for a long time, as Wes said, they may want to come and go. And you're like, oh, now I have to write a check, which I was just thinking everybody would just own their stock. And,
Right.
So.
I think, there's Brooks, did you ever read the book, Great Game Week Business, Jack Stack? Yeah. So I don't know if you've read that or not, Spencer, but I believe that company is a pretty famous book about bringing a company back from the brink of going out of business. And I believe that they ended up being an ESOP. And so I just recommend maybe that's a book to read or research that a little bit. It's also about open book management, which is, hey, let's share all of our numbers with everybody and let's use that transparency to help us move the company forward.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great recommendation for a book to read, or at least read the cliff notes on it as you're thinking about it in ESOP, because it does explain some of the trials and tribulations of doing that and how to make it successful, for sure.
Yeah, and it's just a fascinating story anyway. So
Yeah,
it reads like a novel.
Yeah.
So you guys have mentioned that the ESOP is pretty complicated. I guess what are kind of the just cliff notes on what are the huge benefits to going that route, and then maybe what are a couple of those, things that are in the con column that make it more complicated, or
Sure.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is just that you've got a built-in buyer, right? So if you are looking to exit, okay, well, I'm going to set up an ESOP and I'm going to basically sell to my employees. And so there's some benefits to that. What else, Brooks?
Well, there's some tax advantages if you meet a certain amount of criteria. So there might be it might provide a way for ownership to exit and, take some of their equity over time. So there might be some ways to do that. It puts ownership for employees within reach, where an employee might have an opportunity to create some equity in something that they're working on. For most people, owning a house is their number one chance to create equity. And if you work for a company where they'll actually sell shares or transfer shares as part of a compensation program, I mean, that's a great program. And so both the owner can benefit and the employee can benefit, but you have to meet all these different regulations. So if you're used to working in an environment that's not very regulatory, you might find the ESOP a little bit. You're just like, man, there's a lot to do here. All I want to do is just transfer some shares. Well, so it's going to be very regulated. So a lot of advantages for owner, employee and owner benefit for sure.
Yeah. But once again, I think on the flip side, you do have the high cost, and I think the high structure of it with your reporting. If you take a misstep, then does that void your ESOP, or are there tax consequences, negative tax consequences from not hitting all your marks just right? I think the original question, though, Spencer, was kind of framed about how do I keep the family feel of the business. We're thinking of doing an ESOP, but we want to continue the family feel. And I think if that's kind of your driving purpose is, hey, I want the family feel, the family company, that's the culture and all of that. I don't know that you would have to go with an ESOP. So once again, what are you really trying to accomplish? Are you trying to transfer ownership of the family business down to family members. Okay, that would be one potential goal. Another goal might be, well, I want to keep the family feel, or I just want to keep the culture alive. But family members don't have to be directly involved with management. That might be something different. So I think, once again, you have to look at your situation, step back and go, well, who do I have? I'm not going to live forever. I need to transfer this business. I need to move on. I have some other things I want to do in my life, whether you're thinking of doing this at age 50 or you're thinking of doing it at age 70 or 75, you have to start looking forward. And if you have family members that are involved in the business now, then you have to start talking to them about that. And you have to make some calls about, are those people qualified to run this business? You might have some family members working in the business that have worked there for 20 years, but they're not qualified to run the business, but they're great support and they help with the family culture and all of that. So how do you deal with that?
I would encourage people to take two more steps back from even what Wes was saying, and whomever if you're involved in the business just by yourself, go take a weekend or a week and just go away and take stock of where what your age is, where you are in your life, where you want to go, how much money you need to get there. And once you figure that out, then meet with your partners, whomever your partner's with, and just be frank and say, hey, here's where I'd like to get to. How would this all work out with what you guys want to do? Maybe your partners haven't thought about that at all. And then they go and think about it, come back together. Once the current ownership group is on the same page and everyone understands, oh, I have a 5-year horizon, or I have a 10-year horizon, or I'm never leaving here, then that helps you figure out what kind of plan you want to move forward with. But if you don't do that very initial work, you'll end up working on a plan that everyone's like, well, why are we doing that? That didn't, I wanted to be gone in 24 months, or I'm never leaving. Why would I give shares to some employees? I think that's, and being honest about what you think you want to do. This is not the time to be cagey. This is like, hey,
Yeah,
this is what I'd like to do with my life. And by being honest and forthright with people, you'll just get there a lot quicker versus, hiding the ball all the time. So.
And sometimes we start our businesses because, hey, we need a paycheck, we need to put food on the table, and that's how that business starts. But at some point, it takes on a life of its own, and that's that point where, as Brooks said, you really have to analyze what your ultimate goals are. For some people, their business is just a means to an end, and which is perfectly fine. For other people, their business is their creation. It is their masterpiece, and that's the important thing for them. And so they want that business to go on. And so that's a very different perspective than the person who says, my business is a means to an end, and I don't really care. I want to take my cash out, and I want to, I'm going to move on from that business at some point. So you're going to have very different strategies.
Yes, I would encourage, the person the question came from is just, start, take a few steps back. And maybe they've done all this work, but
yeah,
anybody should take a few steps back before you come up with, at one point in our company, we're like, okay, we're LLC as filing as a sub S. We're like, okay, we're looking at giving ownership to some key employees. We sat down and had some interesting conversations as owners. We had interesting conversations with some of these employees. And it turned out the employees just were not interested. They're like, you know what, we're happy in where we're at. We don't want to take on an ownership role because we don't want the responsibility. We don't want the liability. And as you have those conversations, when people really recognize what that means to be an owner or a minority owner, all of a sudden, there may be very few people that are really that interested in it. So you could come up with your whole plan, and turns out, nobody really interested. So again, talking to stakeholders, I think, is is that
Yeah,
good.
and so I think that's a good point, Brooke. So when you're having those conversations, were you thinking, well, I guess, what was the purpose of transferring some of those? What was your thought between what you wanted to get out of moving some of those shares to employees?
What we wanted to get out of it was we wanted someone to take over the company, and because we had spent 40 years working really hard on the name and the culture, and so we thought, well, we were really very willing to not not necessarily give the company, but for very low cost after we took our equity out, say, hey, well, you just keep on rolling. And there just wasn't anybody who was interested in making that commitment. So for us, what was our goal? Our goal was, hey, it'd be nice if the company could keep going because we've set up this whole machine. And
Okay, yeah. So you feel like, gee, well, in that way, I mean, it's a little bit like we we're talking about before. In that case, it was your baby, your creation. So you're thinking, oh, I do want we kind of created this cool thing and would like to see that progress a little bit further, don't know how far, but a little bit further. The reason I was asking is because in our company, I was looking to get some of my key employees more engaged in the company and really feel like they had some skin in the game and would help it grow. And so I had looked at same sort of thing, giving some stock to employees. And my brother-in-law, who's a very good mergers and acquisitions attorney, he suggested, hey, you may not want to do that. And he said, you may want to do something that they've done a lot of, which is called phantom stock. So the idea is that you can give phantom shares to employees as a motivational piece or an ownership without ownership. So a phantom share of stock duplicates the activity of a regular share of stock. So if the value of the company goes up and the shares go up in value, then the phantom shares go up in value as well. So you could give these shares, and that's what I did. I gave a certain number of shares to some of my key managers, and they had to vest, those shares over a period of time, like 3 years or so. So it also helped tie them to the company. The reason I'm telling you this story is because you can have unintended consequences of what can happen with these types of things. You think, oh, this is great, I'm going to get some shares, or in this case, phantom shares. This will help, and they're going to vest over time. And then those employees will be really tied to the company. They'll be very interested in moving it forward and seeing it grow. What I found was, and this would be different with every set of employees, but in this particular case, some of those employees who received those phantom shares, they weren't happy. I mean, they weren't happy in the sense it didn't probably because they didn't see how they could directly impact the value of their shares by their day-to-day activities. Sometimes they do that through bonuses. Yeah. So they didn't change their actions, which is kind of what I was looking for. Hey, okay, people will show up even earlier. So that none of that happened, which was the positive side of what I wanted to get out of it. And because of the vesting, they basically were hanging around to get their vesting. So, hey, I don't want to leave. And you see that. You talk to people that are vesting in particular shares of their company, and they're going, well, I don't want to leave till I get this vesting done. But as soon as that vesting's done, I'm out of here. So basically, I managed to keep some unhappy people, which was really not beneficial to my company. So anyway, you just have to think about what your consequences or your.
We had a similar situation. What we went with was trying to get our compensation program correct to get employees' goals in alignment with our goals. And so I think having heard your story previously, Wes, I was like, oh, I'm not into the phantom stock or anything like that. So we just know what's
That's right. So you learned from that.
Yeah. So we just went with a really great compensation bonus program, commission program that said, hey, if the employee is successful, we're successful.
Right.
And that worked better because when it was over, it was over. And we didn't have to write any checks later, and it kind of aligned the income and expenses in the right areas. So company's having a good year, everybody's having a good year, the company's having a bad year, everybody's kind of having a bad year. So I steered away from the phantom stock or any stock because of that.
Yeah. Now, in doing Brooks did some research on ESOPs, and one of the things that was pointed out around the ESOPs is just that you do have a built-in buyer in the sense that you have an employee pool to buy, but generally speaking, because the company has to be valued for the ESOP, those valuations tend to come in lower than what would happen if you went out in the competitive marketplace to sell your company to a private buyer. And so you might realize, I don't know, 20% less or something like that for the value of the company. So if your goal was to maximize your gain out of your company, and so once again, what's your goal? Maximize gain. Then you might say, well, no, an ESOP's not for me. I want to go with a straight sale. Now, I will say that you can still go back to key employees and say, would you like to buy the company?
Sure.
You don't have to set up an ESOP. You can say, I want my company to go on. These people I know they can run the company. They're in key positions. There might be someone here who would be interested in buying, and then you can work out a deal with them.
A straight purchase.
Yeah, straight purchase, but and you can make it easy for them to get in and get working on that sale.
So going back to the original question, if it sounds like there's a couple components going on here, they want to maintain the family feel or aspect, and I'm kind of reading into it. We're just making guesses, but I think it gives us some different scenarios for people to think through. So if we want to keep a family feel and culture to the company, like family's got to be involved probably at some level, whether the next generation are minority owners, or maybe like you said, Wes, they're working in the company, but they're not qualified to take over and run the company. So they're involved. And so maybe the goal is, hey, we want to bring in some of the employees into ownership. Maybe we're not going the ESOP route and we want to bring in some key people that are going to be here. They can run it. What are maybe some paths to explore with them? Could they just become minority owners, and maybe that helps that gets them in the game, but it may be between family still is the majority owner, because it sounds like there's a legacy component behind this question. Like we want to keep that going.
I think if you don't have anyone, well, first off, I think one way you could accomplish that is you can keep all the shares of the company in the family in some way. So if you don't have a particular family member that's qualified to run it on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't mean you have to lose that family character. I would say that you want the best person available to run the company. The family character and the culture of the company can be driven by family if you set up a board that supervises the top person, and on that board are key family members, and they know their task is to provide that cultural piece and make sure that that's being honored in the operation of the company. It's not as easy as if a family member is running it and has a good grasp on that family culture, but that's one way.
It might be more balanced in the way that depending again, taking those 2 or 3 steps back, finding out what the current owners want to do. If they're trying to keep that family culture, but maybe there's nobody that's the right age at this point, or maybe there's nobody with the right skill set. And that idea Wes suggested, which is you could set up a family board, which can be the ownership can be within that board. There can be more family members that have ownership stakes, and the family members rotate through the board, but the family's job is to manage the CEO of that company and keep the family culture and make sure that company is doing the things that the family members want. And a lot of times that can come from the whoever started the company, if this is first generation or second generation, someone kind of codifying what is the family culture, what does the family stand for, what does the family mean, and what does this company mean, so that as you go down through the generations, people are able to say, oh yeah, well that's what Grandpa, why he started the company, and that's what he believed, and we're going to continue to do that. Without that, it's just a bunch of family members getting together going, well, this is what we want to do today.
Right.
So you need to do some of that groundwork to make it work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Brooks. I will say, as you go down through the generations, it's going to get harder and harder and harder. And the reason it'll get harder is because you start generation one, 100% ownership with probably one or two people, the founders, and then it fractionalizes to the next generation, and then it fractionalizes again, just depending on how that ownership passes down from generation to generation. But most likely, in most cases, it's going to fractionalize. And so all of a sudden, and you certainly read about this in different business publications, where you have a third generation of family members that are on a board and they're fighting with each other, and they don't get along, and so it's kind of a bad situation. So, and that's even more likely to happen if we don't do what Brooks is talking about, which is, what are we about? What is our culture? What's important to us as a family? And that can be set from the beginning. And then each generation has to be pretty careful to protect that and root out, I hate to say it, the family members that don't support that, either buy them out. That's a possibility, but try to weed out the apples that just don't happen to fit in your barrel from a cultural standpoint of what you want to represent as a company.
So as you guys are talking about this, you kind of said, hey, we need to put the culture down on paper, kind of establish like this is what the company stands for, and this is our overall kind of mission or core values, or, is that a document? And then how does that get enforced, as you move through generations? Are there structures that you can set up to make sure those kind of guidelines continue?
Yeah, I think you go to a board structure, and you can actually operate. You can set up a board, and then you could, through that board, you could work on transferring shares of ownership, and you could lay out a plan. And it depends on your age. If you're 75, you better start getting busy, because your runway is a lot shorter than if you're 50. But in another way, you might have a better idea of who might be the best family members to be on that board, because people are older. If you're 50, your kids are in high school, and you're like, well, I'm trying to set something up, but I don't know who's going to be interested or not interested. But again, as the owner, you need to lay out talk to the stakeholders, and then lay out the best plan that you can, and you have to keep nurturing that plan through time, on a regular basis, and kind of get everybody. It's like, herding cattle, and not that I have cattle, but you're trying to get everybody to go the same direction. Maybe it's like herding cats. I don't know.
Well, I think you could assign that job to somebody on the board, which is,
Sure.
And pass that down. And, you are the keeper of the culture. So here are the things that we stand for. This is what is important to us as a family, or to the original founders, and what they want to have passed down. And so you have to actively search out one or multiple people that will keep that alive and keep bringing that to the forefront, because at the board level and operational level, decisions are made all the time. And people talk about, well, what are your core values and all those types of things? Well, those really drive your decision making. So you have to have that talked about frequently and at all levels of the company, but it's going to start at the board level. And if it's not there at the board level, then it's not going to happen at the, operational level.
Makes
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Jit. It's what are the core values of the company? Getting those, I always call it codified. You have it written down, and you refer back to them, and you're talking about them all the time.
But and that's the point you talk about all the time, right? And I think Brooks is always good to point that out, because if you don't, it's not going to last. It'll just last for whatever generation is really believes in that, and then the next generation probably just drift away.
Yeah. Brutal reality.
Brutal reality. That's right. If you think about it like a car, unless you drive your car and exercise that car and use it, eventually the seals dry up, it leaks, it just breaks down and stops running from lack of use. And the same thing happens with your core values.
Yeah, good
You
point.
have to use your core values all the time. If you don't, it's just a matter of time and it'll all be gone.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, this discussion, we kind of explored a few different routes, but hopefully we kind of answered the question, or at least, gave some thoughts and ideas on how to approach it. I guess as we wrap for today, Brooks, what final takeaways or thoughts on this whole topic?
My final takeaway is always make sure you've done the groundwork first before you come up with a tactic. Just do the groundwork first, make sure everybody's on board, and whatever plan you choose, circle back, because if it's a multi-year plan or if it's a board or something, someone's got to drive the process and make sure it all works. It's not going to happen on its own. That's my thought.
How about you, Wes?
Right. As Brooks was saying, that just made me think about the difference between tactics and strategy again, which is an ESOP or an LLC or any sort of ownership structure is just a tactic for executing whatever your original strategy was, which is basically, your action plan to achieve a goal. So as Brooks says, go back to do your homework. What are your goals? What's my general plan going forward? And then what's the tactic or the ownership structure that would work to get me to where I need to go?
Cool. Yeah. Good advice. Well, again, hopefully, that answered the question around ESOP or gave you some good direction. Complicated process,
Yeah.
So if you do go down that path, there's going to be a lot of things to think through, a lot of structure to put in place, and it'll be a lot of change. But there are other options and other routes that you guys talked about today. So thanks again for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next week on Building a Family Business here on Builder Funnel Radio.